So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. We're a small crowd. So if you guys want to come to these seats, just so it's not like a row of empty seats up front, it'll be sweet. Yeah.
Everybody's VIP here.
Exactly. We actually put out an announcement that only the sexiest people could attend. So that's why you guys were selected to come here. Hence why it's such a small group. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm Stavros. I'm the founder and director of Tawahadna. Tawahadna is a storytelling production house that shoots documentaries on female artists, female identifying artists from this region. We screen them in art galleries and we sell their artwork in spaces and such. But our region is called Swana, and I want to introduce you to Swana before we go forward, because this is a new terminology that people don't typically recognize. We are known as MENA, or Middle East, and unfortunately that terminology was given to us from the West, based on where they are on the map, not where we are on the map, to define where the Muslim countries are. And Swana stands for Southwest Asia, North Africa, and so we are re-identifying and re-colonizing our spaces with our roots and our heritage. So moving forward, we will no longer be using the terminology MENA or Middle East, we'll be using Swana. So that's a little insight on our passion and our drive. Today we're going to talk about building communities, creative communities and creative spaces through music. And joining me are 4 absolutely wonderful individuals that have dedicated their careers to their passion. And so thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to read out your introductions only because you're all so wonderful and you've done so much and it's absolutely beautiful and I'd hate to butcher it. So starting on my left, Lutz, we met in Dubai, and you came without an introduction or a title, and I obviously fell in love with you first, and then I fell in love with what you do. And
we danced together.
Yeah, we did. We danced a lot. And you have probably the most mouthful title I'll ever have to read out, but you're an entrepreneur and a consultant in the creative industry since 1999. You're the co-founder of VibeLab since 2009. You're a spokesman and an executive board member for the Berlin Club Commission, a board member of the city's Berlin Music Board and Chamber of Commerce. So basically, you're a pioneer and a guardian of Berlin's nightlife economy.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me, actually. And then Nagi. Nagi, you started off in advertising, and then you moved into production solely on your passion. And you did it for yourself at first, and then you realized that your passion could be driven to become your career, and for the past 35 years, you've explored every possible venture within the music industry when it comes down to production. You started off in France, then to Lebanon, and now in Saudi, setting up the first concert in Saudi, featuring Mariah Carey, and names that are absolutely insane. We've had 5 minutes of a conversation, and I'm so drawn to how much you have to share, and I can't wait for everyone else to hear about it as well, because it's absolutely beautiful. And Munbir, thank you so much as well. You moved to Delhi from London to launch Magnetic Fields. Well, initially you started your music magazine, which became an event company that then led to something that was missing in India, which is what you learned from the UK, essentially, is the idea of creating a space to celebrate music. And you wanted to marry your heritage and your upbringing into one space, and so you set up magnetic music fields. Is that it? I did well. And finally, Helen, joining us virtually, spiritually, emotionally. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi all.
Hi, how's it going?
Great. Zooming in here from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and you would know it as Melbourne. It's 9 p.m, drizzling, overcast, and humid.
I love it. You're an incredible individual. I was looking up all that I could take from what you've done, and you've dedicated your passion not just to the industry, but to anyone that that did not fit in, essentially. You created safe spaces for all these individuals, not just within the music industry, but anyone that needed refuge or needed to seek some form of understanding who they are in the industry or who they are in the world. And so for that, I am so grateful for individuals like yourself that have created these safe spaces, giving us space to express and understand where we belong.
Thank you.
I can't wait to deep dive as well into this conversation. But before we do so, I want to go around and just understand, where does it all start? Where was this? Where did you begin?
You want to start?
Well, I moved to India in 2011. Pre-moving to India, I was a promoter. Or just going back to before I became a promoter, I studied music production. I got into DJing just before deciding to do just before deciding what to do at university. Got into DJing and decided to do music at university. At university, I felt there was a big gap in terms of what was being promoted in my university town, in terms of the music I loved, and it was totally missing. And I got into promoting at university. And that was sort of my first foray into the music industry, into music business. Throughout my 3-year course, I produced music, and I promoted parties in a town called Reading. And the 3 years came to an end, and I was sort of at a crossroads. It was like, do I want to go down this music industry route, or do I want to become a DJ, a producer? And I was young, and I was making money, and it was a fun industry to be in. So I sort of went down that route and never looked at production software again. Moved to London, again saw a gap for music that I love, starting throwing events. Eventually got headhunted by a club called the Rhythm Factory in East London, which was one of the kind of OG clubs in London. It opened the same year as Fabric. At the time, Fabric was very much the electronic music venue, and the Rhythm Factory was very focused on rock and roll, punk, garage. The Libertines formed there. Some great bands came out of there. But around the time of East London sort of gentrification and Brick Lane and Shoreditch and London becoming very cool around the Rhythm Factory, it sort of lost its stance and lost its voice. So I was sort of headhunted to sort of change that and make it into something that makes sense for the local community of that area of Shoreditch, and kind of made it into a club that made sense at the time. And then got bored. I got bored of life in London. I got bored of the way people treated each other, of the clickiness of the scene, of how unapproachable some people were in the city, and how cool you had to be able to speak to some people.
But you are the coolest, so you could speak to anyone.
I mean, it was just hard. It was just hard to kind of this club was it was run by 2 people, me and the guy that owned it, and we were trying to change things, but we found it very difficult. And decided to leave London. Tried to figure out where to go. India was sort of top of the list because of my heritage. Luckily, my then girlfriend, now wife, also had a love for India. We chose India because it made sense in terms of, I knew one friend there. I had gone to school there for 4 years. And we had, a bit of a support infrastructure. I spoke the language, that kind of stuff.
Did you go back and forth growing up, or was it?
My parents moved me there when I was 14. Lock, stock, and barrel, sold the house, and we moved to India when I was 14 for 4 years to kind of get me more in touch with my roots.
Okay.
I didn't really speak the language, and I didn't really have a connection with all these uncles and aunties and cousins. I didn't even know
all
existed.
432 of them.
Exactly. Yeah. So moved to India, and we were also really careful of not wanting to move to India and be these kind of cool kids from London that kind of knew how to do it all. People had been mixing blood, sweat, and tears to make a scene. Mo sitting in the front row had been doing it for years before us. So, but the one thing we found was that people were not talking about what was happening, and we were kind of seeing pockets of things happening, but people weren't really talking about it. So we started the Wild City, and that was our first kind of community building activity. We started the magazine, and just started talking about what was happening, the cool stuff people were doing, and it sort of expanded into becoming a promoter and working with brands and the festival. But it all started there because we needed to talk about what was happening and sort of represent what was happening there.
Sweet. Nagi?
I've been in the music business for almost 35 years. It started, I started as an executive in the record industry in France. I was the general manager of Polydor Records in France for 5 years. And it happened in the late 80s. And in the early 90s, I decided to come back to Lebanon. The civil war was over, and I felt there was a need for some live music, setting concerts and festivals. So I came back to Lebanon in '94, set up my event production company called Buzz Production, BUZZ, which soon became quite a big operation, operating in many various territories, from Egypt to Morocco, to Algeria, to Syria, to Lebanon, to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi. I've done high-profile shows in all this country, and I specialized at first in A-listers, pop and rock. Then I managed Baalbek Festival in Lebanon for 6 years. Then in 2003, I created Byblos Festival in Lebanon, and it's been ongoing for the past 20 years. We've had a lot of premieres in the area, a lot of very important rock acts were booked regionally through us.
Drop some names. I'm sure everyone's curious to know.
Like
all these.
I don't know, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Roger Waters, Elton John, Phil Collins. All these regional tours were planned and produced by us. And then I moved more into electronic music when the DJ wave hit the world in the mid-90s. So I started programming a lot of premieres with exciting DJs in Lebanon. And I tried to diversify the acts I was booking. I come myself from an alternative rock background. This is the music I like to listen to and advocate. And then, quite naturally, I moved to edgy alternative electronics. And this is how my career was built. Byblos Festival today is probably the biggest festival in our part of the world. We sell between 80,000 and 90,000 tickets every edition. And then in 2017, I got one of the weirdest phone calls of my entire career. Government officials here inviting me to work in Saudi Arabia. I have to confess that I thought it was a phone prank at the beginning. But
especially because nothing was there prior.
Yeah, there was very little happening here, and but I understood from the discussion with these people that although very little was happening, there was this will and energy to create and move forward. So, yeah, I took a chance, came here in 2017. Everyone around me was highly skeptical, I have to say. And it turned out to be one of the most exciting experiences I've been to professionally, but also and foremost humanly. That was simply extraordinary. And breaking the barriers one after the other was a stressful but very rewarding exercise. And I have to say that all the fears we had with each barrier we broke were totally non-justified, because the Saudi public went into it so naturally and organically, as if they had been in a music hub for their entire life. Because what we sometimes forget is how well traveled the Saudis are. So the experience they did not have on their soil yet, they had it in neighboring countries such as Dubai, Beirut, and many other places. So the growth of this market, even if it was a decision from the top down, was clearly welcomed very naturally, and that gives a lot of hope for future developments. And I'm ready to bet that Saudi Arabia is going to be one of the hottest
already
centers of modern music for decades to come.
Well, thank you, Saudi, for having us. Helen.
Well, hello.
Hi.
Hello,
Where does it all
Stavros.
start? How do you become who you are today?
Well, 30 years ago, my partner and I started our little studios, Bakehouse Studios here in Melbourne. It was a space built from the ground up, recycled, upcycled materials. It was often called the cubby house of Melbourne musicians. Very grassroots space, multifunctioned art space, and a hybrid space as well. And we originally had cut our teeth on the sticky carpets of punk venues. I'm a daughter of Greek-Australian immigrants who had a long history of culture and music, was in my household. So even as a teenager, I was promoting bands in high school. And so the first opportunity to do something on the ground was really exciting with my musician partner at the time. Then in around 2010, things changed a lot for us. There was a policy initiative that basically equated music with violence. It was around an election year here in Melbourne, and venues were closing. It was a liquor licensing initiative that made it untenable for venues. So we had spent so many years on the ground, chewing the fat with so many artists, and they were part of our broader community and our close community as well. And we put our hands up and became activists and hosted a large cultural rally where 20,000 people marched on the streets to Parliament demanding a change in these laws. And so it was a moment of change for me. I was really naive, thought we'd go in it and have a big rally with lots of noise and Australians' top-line artists yelling it on the steps of Parliament, and the policymakers would change policy and everything would be great the next day. But that began nearly a 20-year journey now. So from being a yappy little activist on the biting on the heels of politicians, I then found myself with a seat at the table, and with that came responsibility as well. So by 2014, all the demands we'd taken to Parliament were passed, things that we hadn't had for a long time, all ages shows in licensed venues. There was a planning reform, a world first planning reform called the Agent of Change Principle, which has been adapted all over the world, which creates better urban design and puts the onus of the amenity of residents back on the developer rather than the cultural space or the venue. We worked on all sorts of reforms around that time, and I didn't get to retire. In 2015, I was in the periphery of a group of artists who were talking about unwanted sexual activity in venues and at festivals. So I led the sexual assault and harassment task force, and we looked at education policy change around that time, and the work just kept on going. The more I seemed to gather momentum and meet more people and feel this urgency of making our scene better and more inclusive meant that I put my hand up and got involved. And also at the time, there were very few women at the table. So when I had an opportunity to exercise influence, I always took that opportunity. So through our humble little studio, we now host artists from all over the world. Artists, I'll drop some names this time, who have come through Bakehouse. Artists like Ed Sheeran did his first ever show at our studios, first time he came to Melbourne, when he was snapped up by Michael Gudinski, the local promoter. Yeah. Artists like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, you know, we've become a bit of a second home to them. Australian well-knowns, Olivia Newton-John, people that you may not know, and other internationals as well. But it's been such a rewarding opportunity. But the most important thing that we've done in recent years is sponsor and connect and partner with those historically disadvantaged artists. For example, First Peoples and First Nations artists, we provide fellowships and space and a platform for them, but in a way that gives them agency. So our job is to sit back and learn and provide space and for them to practice their art. We also work with many refugee artists and diaspora artists coming out to Australia and run a program with deaf and disabled artists and looking at more visibility and accessibility as well. So that's it. In a kind of 30 years in a nutshell.
That's amazing, though.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, the development of all your careers, as we all evolve, our responsibilities do grow. And so I look at you, Helen, and thank you for taking that initiative and taking responsibility and recognizing with that development, you've also taken high-stake responsibility into recognizing who needs a seat and how do you represent the people that need to take a seat and speak up. And so thank you. I do hope I see more individuals like yourself all over the world to represent this industry in that format. So, with hope.
Oh, they're there, Stavros. They're there. We just need to uncover them.
Yeah. And finally, Lutz.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear all these biographies here and already tipping into our topic and understanding how communities and creative spaces are built. I started also very early after coming back from the US from an exchange as an exchange student, listening to a lot of American hip hop, and then coming to Germany, and there was a new movement of German hip hop, and that was actually something new that Germans started to rap in German, and we started with friends organizing concerts, managing bands, all these kind of things. And while doing so, two programmers approached me. And 1999 was the time where there was not much internet at that point. You had these 56K modems and these kind of times.
Dial-up, yeah.
Dial-up. And they approached me and said, we have this idea of creating a platform where users can actually publish their own events all over Germany. And I said, that's great, because I have trouble getting my events through the gatekeepers of editors in magazines, so let's build up something like that. And we built up one of the biggest platforms in Germany about nightlife. I ran a club for 6 years, I had a restaurant for 3 years. I then became the spokesperson of the Club Commission in Berlin in 2009. So since 12 years I'm doing this voluntarily as a spokesperson of that organization. Building that organization over the years and coming to a point where I was speaking all over the world about how Berlin is kind of embracing nightlife and how we are kind of building this community and getting a voice. I was organizing protests all over the city against gentrification and building developments. And then I met Mirik Milan, my business partner at VibeLab, at these conferences, and was like, you know, it's getting boring a bit, inspiring people on stages, but not really seeing what's happening after that. You know, what is like the next step?
What is the development? Yeah.
Yeah, and people always said like, okay, Amsterdam, Berlin, we're not Amsterdam, Berlin, so we're not getting there probably, whatever. And so VibeLab was the idea of creating a laboratory for vibes. Something where you have to create your own recipe. You have to we can provide you tools and experiences and best practices, but you have to create your own recipe for your city. And that's what we're doing, and that's why we also got involved in helping out in this conference, getting the right people in and finding out what is needed. And of course, we also had to deal with the crisis. So 2020, I could go back all the way back to the first days when I started this internet platform, and now starting as a initiative to support Berlin's nightlife, a streaming platform. It's called United We Stream, and it grew into 120 countries. We had more than 2,500 artists on stage. We collected more than 2 million euros. And it helped in the first couple months to get over this until the government programs
reinitiated.
Helped out. And we also started with VibeLab a global nighttime recovery plan, which brought people from all over the world together. We did studies, the creative footprint in different cities in Tokyo, New York, and Berlin, and now in Stockholm. So that's what we're doing: research, supporting, advocacy.
I mean, during the pandemic, Berlin was the benchmark of what extreme joy was, essentially, when it comes down to going out and seeing your community of individuals that didn't care or go to get judged or so. And so when Berlin was under that light of, oh, the clubs are closed, there's an actual pandemic. Yeah. That's, I think, when everyone that went to a party once in their life was like, okay, this is real, the pandemic is real, we have to take a seat. Berlin has shut down.
So we realized it then
it's
later.
Pretty crazy, yeah. I look back at how music initiated. The initial start of what communities were is escapism. And when we look back at music, we look at disco and the time of which it was an escapism for a group of individuals that did not essentially fit in. They represented the misfits that did not belong, but they found themselves in the ballrooms and wherever, and they found themselves there because they felt loved and they felt joy. And that takes me to what you do, Helen, as well. You create spaces for people like how disco had created these spaces. You create safe spaces for people to understand that they are loved, and there is joy, and there is a safe space for people to come and connect and create together.
And I've been fortunate in that because we were independent, my partner and I, that we could create the bubble that we wanted. And so, way back in the early days, we always did our own recruitment and we surrounded ourselves with like-minded people. So it was a very natural transition into having a set of guidelines around safe spaces. It was something that was easy to write because we worked through this as a lived experience with the people that were coming in. And we found that like-minded people were also drawn to us. But Melbourne's also a very progressive city. And it's politically, it votes different to a lot of the rest of the country. And it's often I think part of Australia would like us to secede and start our own little colony. But the community was there and the music scene was there. But a lot of that came from community radio as well, which is a really major part of what defines the sound and defines the audiences and the kind of music they consume here. In fact, community radio is listened to more than commercial radio. So we have very sophisticated, multi-age group, multi-genred audiences going, and this is pre-pandemic. It will come back slowly. To any type of genre, all sorts of gigs 7 nights a week. You can catch jazz, new age, experimental. Amazing. Yeah. And it's not a huge population. We're about 5 or 6 million people, but music culture is absolutely prominent.
And unlike the blueprint that you already had existing, Nagi, you had to start your own blueprint. you were designing the guidelines. You were designing everything that it needed to become what we do now. Like XP has probably studied, you were probably a case study back then, now, for what you did back then. So
True. I think that the best way to create communities and to make people who love the same things meet and gather is a festival. Festival is a magnet. You've called your festival magnetic fields. It's for a reason. This is what allows people to come and celebrate the common values they believe in. Looking at the Saudi market, for example, you see an overwhelming drive for electronic music. That's because the market here is very much a millennial market. It's an emerging market, started 3-4 years ago with a bang. And as you know, the population here is extremely young. 70% of the population is under 30. So it means something in terms of music tastes. But what I would like to witness is an initiative like Middle Beast, but not only limited to electronic music, but which could include other genres. For example, where is the metal community here? Where is the rock community? Where is the jazz community? Where is even the classical music community? There's got to be some among a population of 32 million.
absolutely.
But the important thing is to find the right tools and the right magnets to make these people gather, because you're far more powerful as a community than as a collection of individuals.
Absolutely. Am I connected still? I think I broke my mic. Don't drink water. I said this backstage that I'm going to ruin my mic, guys, and this is exactly what happened. Looking at what you do, Munbir, you moved to India with this idea, and you were talking about it earlier. How do I penetrate a market without coming off as someone that thinks they know it all? And you're coming here to shape it to what you grew up with. How do you go into something, acknowledge that something's already existing, a culture that is so diverse and vast of beauty and excitement, and you come in to create a festival that's yours, technically as an outsider almost, without insulting or without...
Yeah, of course. I mean, for us, we had the magazine, so it helped us understand local and hyper-local, and that was so important for us to understand what was actually happening on the ground. And going into the festival, it felt like all the festivals that had preceded us and that were running at the time were very much looking at Western ideologies in terms of how to, book, the kind of talent they were booking, the site layouts, the branding, the stage design. And we were like, cool, that's great. And when the scene first started, maybe it needed that because that's also what people want, But for us, it was like, right, we want to import talent. That's important. We want to do the artist exchange, and we want Indian artists to play on the same stages as big international talent. We get that's really important. But ultimately, we also wanted to celebrate India.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean celebrating Indian musicians, but it means celebrating Indian people working in fashion, in food, in design, working with Indian radio stations, not international radio stations. And also celebrating this sort of rich tradition and culture and heritage that comes with a country like India. So everything from our choice of festival venue to location to our branding, it's intrinsically Indian. Like our festival venue is a 16th century palace surrounded by desert. Our branding is inspired by the local village and the art from the local area. And I think when you do something that feels so authentic, maybe is the best word.
Which is almost ironic for someone like yourself to be living abroad, to come and go like, guys, this is us. This is what we should be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you create something so authentic, then you suddenly have loyalists, and then you have a community that understands what you're trying to do and has ownership. And when they have ownership, then they do amazing things on their own, and it just does its own thing, and you can just step away, and that can filter down to, I don't know, like dance floor policing, and making sure people are having a good time, to unofficial Facebook groups that become the support mechanism for our festival that will answer questions before our email address, But I think what makes our event maybe a bit more unique is that we also have the community of Alcisa, which is the village where our festival happens, and the local community, the hyper-local community. We understand our attendees, of course, but we also need to make sure that our local community understands what we're doing and is proud of it and feels like it's genuine and authentic, So we also have lots of local Rajasthani musicians. We have commissioned visual artists to take the local art and make visuals for our walls. We've done the first of its kind, 7-day music residency with German artists and Rajasthani folk musicians to do a 7-day residency on site and then perform it on stage.
What are the similarities that you see with what you're creating there with what we're doing at XP today?
How do you mean exactly?
I mean, I'm looking at Lutz, and you have all that has gone down with XP and how they've utilized the locals to build this space. How much similarity do you see with Magnetic and XP?
I think, being in India the first time in 2010, this development was also huge. I remember when we were invited by the Goethe Institute to come to India, we did some workshops in Bangalore, Delhi, and Mumbai, and we were so niche with our artists from Berlin. There was also festivals, EDM festivals, and we had this little stage with 30 people because the music was, somewhere else. And we were kind of shocked to see, Indians only like EDM and mainstream music. But then somebody told me, and I think that is also something we have to realize, it's a country, we have more than 40 languages. You have a country that is based on Bollywood. There was nothing else than Bollywood for many, many years. Yeah. And suddenly there is this uplifting beat where everybody is united and jumping around and is happy and get together. And of course, over the years since then, it emerged and it became into, it grew into different little niches, and clubs opened, and antisocial, and these little clubs that opened up. I think it's a huge development happening in India, and I think it could be also blueprint. But also what we talked before is the question of prohibited alcohol, alcohol is funding culture all over the world. So it also is an additional challenge in this country to actually build up this culture on ticket pricing and on sponsorships.
Which now for a fact everyone's doing it out of passion and need.
Yeah.
Because they're not depending on that.
So that's a big question. If you can grow and also independently sustainable without the bar revenues.
Do you think that will change how we view festivals and spaces internationally? If they can do it here, if they can build their communities here.
Well, just speaking for India, there's no real government support for a festival like ours.
I see.
There may be support for a festival that supports classical traditional music, but it's still a very conservative society, and there is money for festivals like ours from tourism boards and things like that, but they come with their own challenges, So we always look at the brands because they almost understand our vision a little bit more. Of course, they have their own agenda, but for us, we always looked at our community to see what would work, and that sort of drives every decision that we make. And we do work with, let's, for example, name some brands. We do work with Budweiser, but we work with BudX, which is their surrogate sort of music focus, and rather Red Bull Music, and rather Ray-Ban Studios. And we've always tried to work with brands that at least understand our ethos. Of course, if we didn't have to go to brands, nothing like it, but our market is still new. So, yeah, that is, of course, a big question. But, it's coming out of a need. And I think if it's coming out of a need rather than a want, it's a different thing altogether,
Which takes me to you, Nagi. Everything that you've did here was out of a need. I'm curious to see the context of importance for communities, for individuals like yourself, that you're almost in the back end, designing and building and doing it all. How important are the communities over here to your professional passion?
It is extremely important. It is vital from many points of view. First, it gives you the drive to continue. That's That's very important. Second, it makes sense financially. When you put a show on sale and you see the overwhelming acceptance, and you can sell 35,000 tickets for a large A-lister in Saudi Arabia, well, you say, this market has a bright future. Because it is something to create a subsidized industry, a subsidized market. And when you want to build an industry, unfortunately, you have to go through this. You have to inject some money in the beginning. But if the public is not following, if ticket sales are not massive and consistent, it's a little bit like money thrown out of the window.
Absolutely.
But when you see that the public is responding massively, it means that the ground is fertile. It means that this market eventually is going to grow exponentially. And this is what we're witnessing today. So I'm quite optimistic that within 3 to 5 years, the help we're getting from government money will shrink and will be replaced by private sponsorship and box office ticket sales, which will ultimately make Saudi a normal, organic market that, like other markets in the world, responds to the formula of the 3 tiers. 1/3 for ticket sales, 1/3 for private sponsorship, and 1/3 for public funds. This is the objective for the years to come.
Very cool. Is that something that you follow through with as well, Helen? Do you resonate with the 3 tiers as much?
Absolutely. And I just want to touch on a point that was raised earlier about alcohol sales and alcohol sponsorship. In Australia, you know, it's time to cut the umbilical cord with alcohol and music, we feel. And we're very interested in events and a future without having to be reliant, because it impacts health and well-being. It impacts the mental health of our artists. So on one hand, we're supporting artists through mental health workshops, and there's a wonderful charity here called Support Act that create programs to help artists beat alcohol addiction. And on the other hand, we're being constantly fed and supplied through alcohol companies. So those 3 tiers are very important, and it comes back to the value of music. So when the audiences can appreciate and pay for artists that they want to see, and there's a true value to every ticket price, this is where we'll see a shift from harmful brands into money around artists' income as well. So it's going to be a long journey here in Australia. The association goes way back. Pub shows are a really big part of what makes that small venue culture. Festivals are funded by alcohol brands. So we're really keen to see how things evolve in Saudi.
I mean, we're lucky that we're part of this festival. XP is a great example, and we're so grateful that there is a new case study to follow through with, and we can learn so much from what we're doing over here. So I do see a development with everything that's going to happen in the coming times. We're coming near to an end, and I wanted to know if you had advice about the conversation that your community should be having, or how do you build your community, and what is it that your community should be serving when it comes down to having a community? What is your advice to building the community, and what is your advice to the community when it's set? Helen.
hello, building the community.
I just realized you couldn't see us, and I was pretending like you could see us. I'm so sorry.
I can see you, but I see myself when I speak as well. It's really disconcerting. So really important to nurture local and grassroots communities, because that's your nucleus. And if we're talking about music culture, the centrality of the artist is really important as well. And so we can build industries and ancillary industries around them. But if we don't support the health, well-being, financial health and longevity of artists, community will then dissipate. So we need to look at the nucleus and work out from there. And the pandemic has hit artists really hard around the world. Their ability to make money and tour has had enormous impact. So we're also seeing emerging artists when we're coming back to that. So building music communities, we also need to look at the organic or the ecosystem of how it works. So we're losing emerging artists because of the lack of support and the platform that they're given. Support acts are being thrown out the window, and we're going because of the reduced time required around new world of COVID. There isn't the investment and infrastructure into these emerging artists. We're also going back to old tropes. We're seeing in Australia a lot of lineups with white men, which has always been something that we've tried to move away from years, and people seem to step back into that. So there's an opportunity with this changed environment with COVID, but there's also a lot of warning signs. So respect our community, care for each other, but always center the artist.
I can't wait for the next XP when there's no COVID and you're here with us to celebrate the lack thereof of white men on the lineup.
Looking forward to it, to being there with the sisters.
Yeah. And Lutz, what is it that you could take from here that you look back at Berlin and say, this is what I want to take back, this is something that I've learned, this is something I want to introduce you to?
Well, first of all, I think there's a very big challenge in Case A to build bottom-up structures, to really enable and empower communities. There is a magic, which you've seen in Berlin and you've seen in Detroit, and cities that had a lot of empty spaces, and artists could just take over and do their thing, and then a community evolved and has been created. And I think there needs to be as much support as possible to enable people to actually take ownership, because otherwise you have Disney World. You know, otherwise somebody builds up structures and you have to perform in them. So we need to create something that is really rooted in the local culture and that is also authentic and is created by the people. So at this point, taking something to Berlin is definitely the enthusiasm and the pioneering work that we already saw here on stage very impressively. I think there is, in Berlin we have at the moment a big fear that the music scene is kind of wiped out by big investors and people who are kind of selling out the city. And I think here the opposite is the case. Everybody's kind of super enthusiastic about what is happening. There's like this electricity. So yeah, I'm taking definitely back some enthusiasm, and of course, I mean, we have to deal with this pandemic for maybe even a couple years to come. So we have to figure out how we can respond to it without shutting down culture. We have to. This is part of humanity, so we have to figure this out. And the answer is probably not vaccination, because we will never be as fast as the virus and, you know, producing vaccination, distributing it. We have to do it smarter with digital ways, with testing, with vaccination, and create safer spaces. Yeah. And I think that's something that we have to do, and we have to do it all over the world.
And yourself, Nagi, is there a community that you resonate with most, with your vast background?
What do you mean?
Is there
a community with
vast
I resonate most? What do you mean?
Can you repeat?
And everywhere that you've worked and everywhere you've developed a show and you've produced something, is there a community that you noticed that you've resonated with most?
I would say here.
Wow.
I would say here, certainly. But having said this, there's a risk. Because the Saudi experience is unique. Usually, when you start a market, it goes from bottom to up. This means start with small fan groups that translate into small music venues. These music venues gather communities who share the same tastes or the same belief. And eventually these small venues become mid-size, and then they become large size, and then they gain the attention of the government or of the administration, who generally says, how can we help? Here it's the other way around. It was almost a governmental decision communicated to the bottom. So the risk here is that the bottom gets a bit confused because that's not the way things work normally. So the risk is that the growth doesn't happen as naturally and organically as we would wish. So today, in order to create a solid and expanding community, it's not enough to create mega events like Soundstorm or the shows we do. It's an important element, but it's not enough. It needs to be translated into smaller initiatives, small-scale initiatives. This means that in this country, we're very interested by mega shows. But mega shows alone do not create a market.
100%.
We need mid-sized shows, we need small-sized shows, and we even need very small-sized shows. This is what creates a community and cements it. So we'll see in the coming years, but I'm very confident in the creativity of the Saudi youth.
Absolutely.
Which is more than half, by the way, of the population.
Literally.
Yeah.
I first came here to Jeddah in 2019, and within my second week, I called my housemates. I'm like, pack my bags, sell everything, I've moved. And it was insane. It was surreal, and I genuinely moved. And then the pandemic hit, and I was like, I'm coming back. Please bring my things back. unsell. But you're absolutely right. I fell in love with this creative youth. They offer genuinity that, unfortunately, in Dubai, we don't have. We don't know what our community is. And something else that I recognize is that there's no competition here. Everyone wants to do it because they want to better here. They don't want to do it to better themselves personally. There's so much selflessness with coming up to creating communities that build things like XP and Soundstorm, and so selflessness.
And I need to add something on a personal basis. I've done, I don't know, maybe I've never counted them, but several hundreds of shows in dozens of countries. But the first shows I've done in Saudi Arabia were the only shows where I saw the crowd crying with joy.
Wow.
I've never seen this anywhere else in the world. But the first DJ festival we created here, people were dancing and crying at the same time. So it's something very unique that gives me really hope and enthusiasm in the coming years.
That's beautiful. Do you see people crying at your festival, Munbir?
I do, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is the value of your community, and what is it that you would expect off of them? And
I mean, just to bounce off what you were just saying, I think it is all about understanding your community. Obviously, the most important community to me is my community, but there's offshoots of that community that do their own thing, and labels form and collectives form. And just a quick example, I know we're running out of time, but in 2016, we launched our lineup for the festival. Usually a happy moment, the lineup goes up and people get excited and tickets start moving, etc. And for us, that excitement almost instantly turned to regret as we looked at the lineup and saw that 85% of the people were male and 15% were female. Rather than waiting around for things to happen, we got support from the British Council. We did workshops in 4 cities in India, teaching DJing, production, music business with partners like Ableton, Native Instruments, Pioneer. And out of those workshops, real community formed and a collective formed. And they all supported each other. And we now do an annual report with the British Council, also trying to understand how women interact with nightlife in India. So it's not also about supporting people to DJ and produce and understand the business, but also understand how to make the dance floor safer. Anyway, but this community has grown to a level now, and I'm still very much a part of it, to a point where, you know, one of the participants is a resident DJ of ours, 2 of them have open stages at the festival. In my opinion, the EP of the year was just released by one of the participants. So, and these small little grassroots initiatives and small initiatives are really the foundations of a scene, you know? And what is community? Community is a shared love of anything. It's a shared love, a shared curiosity, a shared desire. And I think here in Saudi, there is that. There is this shared desire and goal and aspiration that everyone shares.
100%.
And it's just about working at that together.
So from accountability to solution to community. You've killed it. That is the way. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Lutz, Nagi, Munbir, and Helen. Afkharistopoli.
Barakallah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That concludes. Oh, you have questions? Do we have questions? No time for questions. I'm so sorry. But we're so small, we could like hang out.